Hello everyone, this is Jotto and welcome to my video on budget builds. Now, starting off in a new game can always be a little bit troublesome, especially when it comes to free to play because, well, you need to build up a collection when it comes to card games, and that poses some issues. However, there are quite a few budget builds out there which are actually quite good for when you're starting out. Now, before we get started, one of them is mine, two of them are not. I will link I'll link all the lists in the description, but two of the lists I'll be looking at today are actually from a guy called Erlexx, who has done quite a lot of good work when it comes to making super budget builds. And as a result, both of his lists are actually quite similar to each other. But that's partly because they both work around an engine that works really well with low rarity stuff. So anyway, first things first, we will get into the Budget Assassin. Now, Budget Assassin has almost no crafting cost to it. It's actually kind of insane. There's only 6 rares in the entire deck. Now, keep in mind, you actually do get a lot of commons and also some rares from the campaign and your starter decks. So the actual crafting cost of these decks will be a lot lower than the number it shows. So for this one, it's 2,800, but in reality, most of the commons you already have, and it's also including those. So anyway, first things first, this deck is based around 2 particular cards. The first one is Hexmage, which is a 5 mana 4/4. Whenever you play an action, deal 2 damage to your opponent. So this allows you to play a whole bunch of spells and then just deal massive amounts of damage to your opponent. And the other card it's based around is Crystal Tower Crafter, which is a 2 mana 2/2, and whenever you play an action, Crystal Tower Crafter gets +1/+1. So it gets bigger and bigger, and you can just deal tons of damage with your 2-drop. So that's what the deck's built around, is these 2 primary win cons. Now, the rest of the deck is pretty much cheap spells and ways of making cheap spells. So, as far as the non-spells goes, we've got Brutal Ashlander, 1 mana 1/1, Last Gasp, deal 3 damage to a random enemy. Now, this does include creatures and also your opponent, so it can be used for direct, but there's also a little bit of randomness in there, which can be a bit problematic. However, the effect is incredibly powerful, and there's actually methods of sacrificing this deliberately in the case of Soul Split, where Soul Split for 2 mana, you get to sacrifice a creature and get 2 3/2s, 1 in each lane. So if you sacrifice the Ashlander, you still get its death effect, which can still kill something on their side or deal 3 to the face. Now, the other creatures besides the Crafter is the Abyssea Navigator, who's a 2 mana 3/1, and if the top card of your deck is an action, you draw it, otherwise put it on the bottom. Now, that's important because it means that you've got a higher chance of getting an action on the top if you miss anyway. So this guy basically allows you to get more and more spells, which is what you need to actually win the game with this particular deck. Then we've got High Rock Summoner. Now, High Rock Summoner is a 2 mana 1/1, and it has Summon, put a random Atronach into your hand. Now, the Atronachs you can get off this are, see if I can find this, Flame Atronach, who is not showing up. I'm blind. Okay, apparently I'm not blind. It just doesn't show up here. Nope, just doesn't show up here. So anyway, can I get them on the... Anyway, so it's a 4 mana 5/3 with Breakthrough, which apparently is just not a card, so you can't actually find it, which is a little unfortunate. So anyway, it is a 5/3 with Breakthrough, and then there's a 5 mana 5/5 Frost Atronach with Guard. And then there's the 6 mana 7/5 with Ward, which is the Storm Atronach. So those are the 3 separate Atronachs you can get off of High Rock Summoner. Now, outside of that, we've got 3 more creatures in the deck. Cunning Ally. Now, Cunning Ally is 3 mana 3/3, and if the top card of your deck is a blue card, then you get a free Firebolt, which is always nice. 1 mana, deal 2 damage to your creature, so that's free removal. We've got the Telvanni Arcanist, who's a 3/2 for 3, and when he dies, it gives you a random action. This can be any spell in the entire game, but the point is, it's more and more spells. You're really hoping for some cheap ones off this guy, because it helps with you actually win the game. And the last creature in the deck is the Varanus Courier, the 3 mana 1/3 with guard, and when it dies, you draw a card. So, as you can see, pretty much every creature in the deck is designed to generate value when it dies or when you play it, so it can be used as Soul Split, or just give you extra spells in the case of Cunning Ally and Arcanist and things like that. So it all gives you extra spells. So what spells are you getting? Well, almost every spell in the deck is extremely cheap. The only one that's above 3 mana is the Lightning Bolt. So we've got Lesser Ward, 0 mana, give creature ward, so it blocks the first instance of damage, and this can be used to protect your Hex Mage in particular against blue decks, for instance. So Lesser Ward is very, very nice there, and more importantly, it's a 0 mana spell, so you get bonuses off it. Then we've got Arrow in the Knee. Yes, I know, this is actually a card. 1 mana, shackle a creature and deal 1 damage to it, so it allows you to play Hexmage in one lane and then just shackle something on the other side so that it can't be attacked into, which is very, very nice against decks that don't have removal. So, yeah, helps stalls out the game a little bit when you're trying to win the game with Hexmage or with Crystal Tower. Then we've got Firebolt, very, very cheap removal. Now, note, on the actual deck, it does talk a little bit about playing the deck, and one of the main things he highlights is don't play Firebolts if you don't have to early, because you want to keep spells for later, and taking a few hits is fine because then you can draw some cards and then get closer to your actual win conditions. So it's not always necessary just to firebolt something immediately on turn 2 or 3. You can actually save this for a little bit later and just focus on playing your value creatures. Then we've got Shadow Shift. Now, Shadow Shift is move a friendly creature, draw a card, just 1 mana. So you get to cycle, you get to move things around, so you get a little bit of extra damaging. So you want to chip your opponent down a little bit before you start going off with Hexmage. He recommends 21, which is apparently the rough amount that you can actually do with the deck. But in general, depending on your hand, you can just use Shadow Shift to chip them down a little bit with things like Cunning Ally and Arcanist, dealing 3 each, and that should allow you to close out the game a couple turns after that. Then we've got Finish Off. Now, Finish Off, 2 mana, destroy a wounded enemy creature. This is actually quite nice because you've got Arrow in the Knee, you've got Firebolt, and also you don't really have any hard removal, but you do have really, really random small creatures like High Rock Summoner and Ashlander and Courier, which means you can just use Finish Off to deal with anything that is kind of scary that you can't really race. And it's a very, very handy spell to have around. No Leaf Lurker in this deck because 2 things. 1, it's an epic, and 2, that would be 5 mana to actually use it, whereas this is nice and cheap. Then we've got Ice Spike, very, very simple spell. 2 mana, deal 2 damage to your opponent, draw a card. It's just face damage, and you get to cycle into more spells, and with Hexmage, it just becomes 4 damage, and then cycle, you get the idea, so it just allows you to keep dealing damage to your opponent while not running out of cards. Soul Split, we already mentioned, but as you can see with the rest of the creatures, now we've been over them, most of them are pretty good Soul Split targets. So like High Rock is only a 1/1, turns into 2 3/2s. Ashlander, you get the damage. Even stuff like Arcanist, which isn't fantastic since you actually only gain 1 3/2, you still get a random action. And Courier, you get to effectively draw a card immediately. So Soul Split's very, very good in this particular deck. Now, the last 2 spells are just direct burn. We've got Thievery, 3 mana, deal 3 damage to your opponent, gain 3 health. This is one of those cards which you really don't expect to ever see play, but sometimes it actually is actually worth it because, well, it lets you race. It's 3 damage to them, you heal 3, it's a spell, and it's just direct burn. It can't be used against creatures, but in this particular case, you're just trying to burn your opponent out before you die. And the last spell in the deck is Lightning Bolt, 4 mana, Prophecy, deal 4 damage. Now, the Prophecy on this is what's specifically brutal. Because, yeah, if you prophecy something and you have a Crystal Tower or a Hexmage in play, it actually counts as a spell being played, which means you get the additional effect. And it means you have Burn on Prophecy, which makes it hard to race into you, and it's just really, really rough. Lightning Bolt is a very, very good card, and it's also just single target removal if you need it. So that's a basic rundown of the Budget Assassin, a very, very spell-focused deck. And extremely cheap to craft up. I have actually played this deck a little bit, and I think the deck is actually quite good. This particular deck has got to Legend, so it's definitely worth respecting. So if you spend a little time trying out this deck and maybe upgrading it a little bit later on, then it's definitely something which I think is worth investing time into. And the crafting cost is not prohibitive at all. So even if you don't like the deck, mess around with it a bit and then try something else. Now, onto something which is very, very similar, but in a slightly different direction. Now, this was actually made by the same guy, which makes sense because the deck is very, very similar in terms of game plan. But it's another spell spam deck. So we've still got the same core of Hex Mage and Crystal Tower Crafter. And in terms of the repeated cards, we've got Lesser Ward, Ashlander, Firebolt, Ice Spike, Soul Split, Navigator, Cunning Ally, Telvanni Arcanist, and Lightning Bolt. So that's all the same, so I won't really go over those since I pretty much just did. So what are we substituting in this particular list? Well, instead of playing green, this particular list plays yellow. So what does yellow actually give you? Well, the most important thing in my opinion is Piercing Javelin. Piercing Javelin is an incredible card and really does make it very, very hard to race into you. Prophecy on Destroy a Creature is just incredible, and it will allow you to beat a lot of the aggro decks, and I think that's one of the main reasons why this particular list is a little bit better in some matchups and a little bit worse in others. You're missing out on some of the burn, but you do have a lot of extra defense. You got Piercing Javelin with Prophecy Destroy, then you also have Healing Potion, which has Prophecy gain 5 life. Now, Healing Potion is one of those cards that's like, oh, gain 5 life, you lose a card? That sounds kind of terrible. However, it only costs 1 mana. You have Hex Mages and Crystal Towers that you get bonuses off, and it allows them to hit you a couple times, and then you can draw Healing Potions. You don't even have to Prophecy them. You can actually just draw them, put them back into your hand, and then play them with Hex Mages later, and you've effectively just drawn 2 damage. So it helps you combo off a little bit more safely, while still having the cheap spells, since you don't have Arrow and Shadow Shift in this deck. And now outside of that, you're also getting Execute, which is your direct removal that green didn't really give you. So you got Execute instead of Arrow pretty much. Destroy a creature of power 2 or less for 1 mana, which deals with a lot of just really, really obnoxious things in the early game. Stuff that comes to mind is 5th Legion Trainer, which can be deadly if it's left in play, the 1/3. And also just other really random stuff like Cut Purse that can keep growing, and that's going to be hard to handle. So Execute is actually a decent card, especially when your entire deck is driven by spells. Now, outside of that, we've got Scouting Patrol. Scouting Patrol is 1 mana, summon 2 1/1s, 1 in each lane, but it's a spell, so it actually works with Crystal Tower and Hex Mage. And also it allows you to apply a little bit of pressure earlier, which is always appreciated when you're trying to chip them down a little bit. Then we've got Crushing Blow because, well, you're not running green anymore, so you're missing a bit of the burn. So having a neutral 3 mana deal 3 damage adds a little bit of burn back into the deck. And this is the kind of card which, if you feel like you don't have enough burn in the green version, you could also try out Crushing Blow in that list as well. So yeah, Crushing Blow, very, very solid card. You'll see it in a lot of budget lists in particular because it's always solid. And even some fully constructed lists run Crushing Blow because deal 3 damage, a lot of colors just don't have access to that, so having it in neutral is just incredible for some color combos. Now, the last addition to the deck with this color combo is the Auridon Paladin, which I'm not sure if I said that correctly. Anyway, 4 mana 4/4, whenever you play an action, most of the deck is actions, it gains Drain for this turn. Now this allows you to race them a little bit, and it's also a 4/4 beater. So you play your Paladin, you maybe deal 4 damage with it, gain some life, and then that sets you up for your Hex Mages in a couple of turns, since you're less likely to die between all the defense you're given. And this kind of deck in general feels like it'd be better in a aggro meta, whereas the green deck feels like it'd be better in a more slow, control-y metagame. But overall, same game plan, but they play a little bit differently. So those are my 2 sort of very, very budget lists I've decided to highlight. Now, onto something a little bit more expensive. Now, this is the type of deck which a lot of people recommend to new players. I'm not massively convinced because it is a bit more expensive. However, if you want to try out a Spellsword variant for cheaper, then I've got a list that I've sort of thrown together here that I think is decent. Now, the reason I say that this is a bit of a strange list to recommend to new players is because for Spellsword to be effective, you need 3 Divine Fervors. You just do. You are given 1. 1 comes in the starter deck, but you need 3. Now, before I get started, I do want to say this is the type of list that I started with. I did the campaign, then I played some arenas, and then I crafted up some fervors. That's sort of the order I did it in, and it did work. But it means that if you don't really like arena, you're a bit stuck because you don't really have the dust yet to craft up something like this, and then it causes a few issues. So that's why you want to be looking at some of the previous lists if you really don't like Arena and you just want to jump straight into Constructed. So what have I done for this list? Now, I have restricted myself to 5 epics. However, I do want to say every single card in this list that is rare or higher, so rare or epic, is the kind of card which is useful across multiple decks and you won't regret crafting because they're useful over a lot of different types of decks, not just the aggro variants. So we got the 3 Divine Fervor, which is incredibly powerful. 4 mana, friendly creatures are +1/+1 permanently, and there isn't much support removal at lower ranks especially, and it causes a ton of problems when you get 1 or even 2 out, and it's just astonishingly powerful. This is one of those cards that sees play in a lot of different yellow decks, anything aggro or mid-range, which is actually quite a wide span of decks nowadays, so it's a very, very good epic to have around and is the linchpin of the deck. Now, the other epic that I've decided to include is 2 Shadow Fem Priest. 5 mana, 4/4, summon, silence another creature, or destroy an enemy support. This is an incredibly powerful card that is played in pretty much every single purple list. It's one of the highest craft priority epics in the entire game, in my opinion, and is a very, very powerful card. I've only included 2 because you don't really need 3 in this kind of deck. But having 2 Shadow Fem Priest is a very, very nice card to have in your collection in general, and having the silence on a 4/4 is very, very nice, and also having support removal will help with the fact that a lot of lower ranks is just Divine Fervor decks everywhere, because you get so much impact out of just a few Divine Fervors, which means if you don't have much dust to throw around, you can throw it into Divine Fervors, and then you get a lot of value for your dust, which is one of the reasons why the deck is so popular at lower ranks. So that is the epics. Now, I have modeled this a little bit after my other Spellsword deck, which I did deck tech on last week, that I ended up getting top 15 with. So that's the full deck this builds into eventually. So if you want to go see that, then I'll link it in the description. But anyway, so this is a bit more aggro-centric since you don't have a lot of the later game value cards, but it does have a few notes of mid-range. So first things first, Scouting Patrol. Now, Scouting Patrol we already have been over in the yellow spells deck, the 1 mana, summon a 1/1 in each lane. This is a card which I don't really like in terms of mid-range. However, if you're trying to be a little bit aggressive and you've got Resolute Allies and Divine Fervors, which we'll get to a little bit later, then Scouting Patrol can actually do a lot of work. It's not what I would recommend for mid-range, however if you're trying to rush people down, it is actually quite nice since it will be 2 damage, but later on you can draw it and then play it and then it'll be 4 damage or 6 damage, so that's actually a lot better for a 1-drop, so it's actually a decent card in this situation. Then we've got the standard mid-range 2-drops. Broma Profiteer gains some life, 3/2 for 2. It is a rare, and if you're trying to sort of craft into this but you don't have everything, there are a couple common substitutions like the Skin Grab Patroller, which is almost the same card, you just miss out on some life gain, which is not optimal, but that's not what budget building's about. So anyway, Broma Profiteer, 3/2 gains you some life, which actually does help in racing a little bit. Then we've got Dragontail Savior, which is 2 mana, 2/3 summon. You get +1 attack for each enemy creature in this lane. Very, very solid card. Will be a 2/3 on turn 2, but later on it'll be a 3/3, 4/3, 5/3, which is a nice top deck to have in the late game. Gives you a lot of punch on your 2-drop. Then we've got the Soldier, 2 mana, 2/3 guard. Very, very solid creature. Will mess with some cut purses in particular, and just allows you to sort of race a bit more effectively, because you can defend against one lane and then apply pressure in the other, or you can play in the shadow lane, play a soldier down, and then they have to deal with that first, and it's just really, really awkward. So yeah, the Soldier, very, very solid 2-drop. Windkeep Spellsword, 2 mana, 2/2 with Ward, arguably the best 2-drop in the entire game. Pretty much trades with every other 2-drop I can think of. It trades with most 3-drops, and in some cases will actually just take out the 2-drop without any loss in value whatsoever in the case of stuff like Fighters, Guild Recruits, or any 3/2 bodies. Now, the last 2-drop in the deck is the 5th Legion Trainer. 2 mana, 1/3. Whenever you summon another creature, give it +1 attack. Now, this can be a bit awkward to run out on turn 2 sometimes because it's very, very vulnerable. However, that effect is incredibly powerful if you can protect the trainer, and if you have, say, a Scouting Patrol, then it becomes 4 attack worth of tokens. And you can keep playing later and generate incremental value. There aren't as many tokens in this deck as there are in some of the full token builds. But in general, very, very powerful card, and this is something which the starter deck is pretty much built off, is this sort of concept of running out the 1/3 that buffs everything. So onto the 3-drops, Crushing Blow. Mentioned this before. Crushing Blow is a very, very nice budget card in general. Gives you a bit of burn, gives you some nice removal, and it's actually just a decent card. You can just keep running this if you like it, and a lot of fully complete lists do run the Crushing Blow. Very, very nice card, and I would not underestimate this thing. Then we've got Eastmarch Crusader, 3 mana 4/2 summon. If you've destroyed a rune, you get to draw a card, which lets you keep cycling and keep attacking. And it's just a very, very solid card. It's not really a 3-drop, though. You can't really play us on turn 3. However, turn 4, turn 5, it gives you a little bit of late-game punch. And unlike stuff like Pit Line, it doesn't cost 400 dust to craft, which is always nice. But Eastmarch Crusade is also a card that you will see in a lot of yellow decks moving forward. Then we've got Imperial Legionnaire, which seems to be my signature card at this point. 3 mana 3/4 at common. Very, very, very bland card. However, 3/4 for 3 is quite good in terms of stats. It's not as good as Young Mammoth, which is also in the deck. However, it's a decent substitution for Young Mammoth, and at common, you'll have them straight away, and it will pretty much always be good. And in my opinion, I think the card is actually good enough to be played in the full list, but I will leave that up to you to make the decision on that. Then, before we get on to Resolute Ally, we've got the Young Mammoth, which is the only purple 3-drop. 4/4, Breakthrough, always a little silly for 3 mana. The Breakthrough is actually arguably a drawback because you'll keep breaking runes when you don't want to sometimes. However, this deck is a bit more aggro focused, so breaking runes isn't that bad, and you just want to stay ahead on life for Golden Saints. Now, I have included the Young Mammoth over the Haunted Spirit, since I didn't want to go full on rares everywhere, although there are already a lot of rares in this list to begin with. As I said, this deck is a little bit more expensive than the other two lists I went over. But I decided to just go for the Legionnaire instead of the Haunting Spirit, and then play the Young Mammoth as the better of the two 3-drops, because I wanted to lopside the deck a little bit towards yellow to help out with Resolute Ally. Now, Resolute Ally, 3 mana 3/3, summon, give other friendly creatures in this lane +1/+1 if the top card of your deck is yellow. Now, this is a little random, but it gives you a lot of punch, and it's not reliable punch, but that's the thing about budget deck building, is you've got to give up a little bit more of the secured power you get out of some of the more specific higher rarity cards that also happen to have things like drawbacks put on them to compensate, like Pit Line, for instance. So yeah, you are a little bit gimped by this occasionally, but when it works, it's really, really good, and it makes all of your smaller creatures into big ones, and it makes your medium-sized creatures into absolute tanks when it comes to threats. Now, as I said, this deck is a little bit more mid-rangey than token-focused. It's sort of in the middle of the two different builds, so Resolute Ally will have a little bit less of a direct impact, but the card is still extremely good. Now, we already talked about Fervor being very, very good, so it's on to Hive Defender. Now, Hive Defender is 3/6 for 4 mana with Guard. Just incredibly good stats, pretty much. 3/6, you get to protect your board while you keep attacking, and overall, the card is very, very good. It's very, very simple, but the stat distribution on this is just perfect. 3/6 with Guard is a big, big threat. On to the Midnight Sweep. Now, this is one of the defensive prophecies in the deck. There's only 2 defensive prophecies in this deck, since the third one you want to have a look at is Huskarl at Epic. So, 4 mana, summon a 2/2 Trooper with Guard in each lane, and it has Prophecy, which can actually help out a lot. And if you have Divine Fervor in play, or 5th Legion Trainer, then they become 3 attack on the Midnight Sweep, which is really, really good. And in general, this helps you out a lot. And it's actually one of the reasons why Profiteer, while not being essential, as I said, you can always just substitute it out for the common 2-drop instead. The life gain is actually quite nice when you got stuff like Midnight Sweep in the deck. Now, the last 2 cards in the deck are Piercing Javelin. Already mentioned this earlier. Prophecy, destroy creatures, always nice. And you have it as hard removal, one of the best yellow cards in the entire game. The last card is the Golden Saint, running 3 Golden Saint because I don't have stuff like... Well, I mean, 3 Golden Saints, not that bad in general, but a lot of the builds run 2 once you get some of the big legendaries, but as I said, cut all the legendaries because they're a little expensive, so you don't have things like Nahaghlib or Bone Colossus. So you got 3 Golden Saints, but they're still very, very good. 6 mana 4/4 with Guard, and if you have more health than your opponent, which will probably be the case if you're playing this deck for most of the game, you get a second one in the other lane. And that works really, really well with Resolute Allies the turn after, or Divine Fervors already in play, or 5th Legion Trainers, and you get sort of a half and half on the tokens type of theme with Golden Saint, where it's a big guy, but it's also an extra token on the other lane. So that's sort of my rundown of the budget Spellsword deck as well. Now, as far as crafting cost goes, I do have these in front of me. The first two lists were just over 2,500. However, as I said before, you get a lot of the commons in the starter decks, a lot of them, which means that crafting cost drops through the floor very, very quickly. Now, as for the Spellsword deck that I just had a look at, that's at 5,300, since there are some epics in it. Now, keep in mind you do get one fervor for free, which is nice, and I would highly recommend crafting the priests and the fervors for future deck building anyway, unless you just really don't like the idea of playing Spellsword, which is fine. And then you can just develop the spell decks a little bit more. Now, in terms of moving forward from there, when it comes to running the two spell decks, there's a couple really, really high rarity additions, which I'm not really going to go into too much. I mean, you've got a couple legendaries, for instance, like the Daggerfall Mage that gives you a book, which gives you extra draw, which some of the spell-heavy decks actually do run, but I think that's a little bit ambitious when you're just trying to pick up a deck for the first time and feeling it out. It's like, oh, where do I go from here? Yeah, you're not really looking at legendaries when you're doing that first. Outside of that, I've seen some people running Brilliant Experiment. Cruel Firebloom is also a decent card that you can run since you do have Ashlanders in the deck. And in the case of the green version, there is the Summoner. And in the case of the yellow version, you've got Scouting Control tokens, things like that. Besides that, there's not much else. I mean, there's Elusive Schemers, that gives you a bit of velocity, but I wouldn't exactly call them necessary, because Elusive Schemers are very, very good in the long game, and generally you want to end the game quite quickly when it comes to the spell spam. Outside of that, Ice Wraith is a bit slow. Maybe Ice Storm, that could be quite good at Epic. Once you get them, try them out. They are spells, and they also just stall out the game a little bit longer, and they actually don't kill Hex Mage when you play the Ice Storm, which means you can get through taunts. And the only other card I can really think of at higher rarities is probably Supreme Atromancer. I think that's about it. Besides that, a lot of the other cards that you can kind of have a look at high rarities in terms of Assassin and Mage are probably not that good in pure spell, like Kinsman is what I'm thinking. Well, I mean, yeah, there's Ungolem, but that's a bit of a longer game card. There's House Kinsman, which could be an interesting one, and this is actually a card I would highly recommend crafting if you want to play any green decks. But I think that's about it. I could have missed something, but I think that's about it as far as upgrading the two spell decks. In terms of Spellsword, if you want to know the full version or something close to the full version, as I said, there is a deck tech in the description. But anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, want to ask me any questions, put it in the comment section below. As I said earlier, I will link all three decks that I covered in the description, so you can go have a look at those directly. But as now, it's been Jotto, signing off.